It's time for another episode of the NRG Oncology Podcast, and today we are doing something a little outside what we usually do. For those of you who have been listening into our podcast since the beginning, you might recall that the idea of the NRG Oncology Podcast was actually inspired by the San Antonio-based Dinosaur George podcast for kids. So today we have none other than George Blasing, the host of popular Dinosaur George podcast, because we wanted to get advice on communicating about complex science topics like paleontology and cancer on a level that is understandable.
George has literally reached millions of audience members through his podcasts with an international fan base. I was introduced to his podcast by my wife and my 6-year-old son, William, who asks for Dinosaur George every time we get in the car. So, George, to start off, I've been itching to ask this question. Is there any evidence from the fossil record that dinosaurs got cancer?
Yeah, there is. If it's evidence left in the bone, if it's a deterioration of the bone, it leaves very distinctive evidence of. Now, let me rephrase that. There are some times that infections can leave the same general thing. So let's say a dinosaur gets bitten and the animal survives, but it becomes infected. But there is some what appears to be cancerous growth on the bone. And so since modern animals suffer the same thing, yeah, there'd be no reason why dinosaurs wouldn't as well.
So at Stephen's urging, I've listened to some of your work, and it's amazing that you've been communicating about paleontology to children and the general public for decades, whereas Stephen and I have only been at this less than a year, effectively communicating about complex science topics to a general audience is very much something that we aspire to do as well as you. What goes through your mind when it comes to boiling complex subjects down to something that everyone can understand and appreciate for your podcast?
What I think back to, the catalyst for me occurred several years ago. I was at a talk listening to a paleontologist talk about pathologies. In fact, what I was just referring to, injuries on the bone, and what we can glean off of that information. And it was open to the public, and it was touted as a family-oriented talk. And there was a man, his wife, and his son sitting directly in front of me. And as the speaker was talking, a perfect example was, he said, on the caudal 4, we found evidence of predation. And the little boy turned to his dad and said, "What does that mean?" And the dad's response was, "I have no idea." Now, what the man had said was, on the tail vertebra, they found a bite mark. And I thought, had he just said that, every person in attendance would have immediately recognized what he just said. But because he's a professional paleontologist, he communicates on a level that's different. You all, as professionals in the medical industry, speak a different language, for lack of a better description, to the average person like myself. You speak a different language. You use words that the average public doesn't understand. Another example, in that same talk, he said the D4 had a clear crack. And again, the boy looked at his dad, and I knew what the man was talking about. What he was saying was the dentiary number 4 tooth had a crack, but nobody could comprehend other than the people, the professional paleontologists in the room. And at that point, I thought to myself, God, I'd love to go up there and just take the microphone and be the translator. When he said this, I would say this. When he said caudal, I'd say tail. When he said dorsal, I'd say hip. And so that was the motivator for me when I came up with the concept of a podcast, to do it in English. When I use the term English, I'm roughly using a language that we can understand. And so you'll hear me say things like upper leg bone, but I'll say femur, but I'll justify it with the upper leg bone. Or if I say digit, I'm talking about a finger bone. And so I think I found a way to bridge the gap between the average person and the professional word. So I don't dumb it down. I just explain the words, I guess, is my best description.
I think these are really great examples, not only for paleontology, but for also us as physicians. We talk about really the same anatomic principles all the time, and for us, femur, caudal, etc. We all know what we're talking about, but I think this is great perspective. Just talking about how you deal with paleontology and there's a lot of dinosaur podcasts out there. And one of the reasons my wife and I chose yours to listen to, a lot of them, and there's some very good podcasts out there, different dinosaur podcasts that are really more for entertainment, the fighting dinosaurs. But yours, as far as I can tell, like you were mentioning, is trying to bring the level of the audience up rather than dumb things down. I think it's also a common mistake in medicine when we presume that patients, family members, even our pediatric population might not be sophisticated or interested enough to understand what we're saying. So when I approach a patient, I really try to go in with the presumption that they want to be engaged intelligently. In your experience with children and audiences around the world, what are some of the strategies you use to bring them up rather than dumb things down?
When I created the podcast, I have a format. I have an outline that I follow every time. And so I make it a point when I'm talking about a specific dinosaur, the things I cover. I cover its name, then I explain that that's the genus name. And then I talk about the species name, which basically means its last name. So kids immediately recognize that all dinosaurs have a first and last name, and it's called genus and species. So right there, I was able to incorporate something educational that has meaning. And so then we talk about diet. Is it a carnivore, herbivore, omnivore? Well, if it's an herbivore, then I explain always with the tag, that means it eats plants. And so if you are a 25-year-old adult and you hear the word herbivore, you know exactly what it is. If you're a 6-year-old child and you hear herbivore, from this point on, you're going to remember that's an animal that eats plants. And so I think by giving adult information at a level that a child can understand it, it makes them step up to the next level. So rather than me talk down to them, say, it's a Vegisaurus. That's cute. Of course that's cute. But that's kind of targeting a very narrow audience. But when you teach a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, what herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore means, from that point on, any book they read, anything they see, they feel a part of that because they can understand it. So I never want to target beneath what I think a child is capable. I think we underestimate the general public as well. I think in your industry as well, that maybe we have a tendency to think because they don't grasp what a word is, then the knee-jerk reaction is, well, let me come way down here and start talking like they're children kind of thing. I think kids are more advanced, and I think they embrace my podcast because they get to learn something, but it's never over the head. I'm lifting them up to be able to understand what it is I'm talking about.
I think this idea is just so important in medicine as well. I feel really strongly that one of the most important things that I do when I meet a new patient is to do my best to teach them as much as I know about them and their scenario as I can, so that they share that same deep understanding, at least of their disease scenario, so that they can make the best choices for themselves. And sometimes that's tricky to do, but I do think it's just incredibly important. Now, if I may, I'd like to turn to something a little more personal. Being the public figure that you are, you publicly disclosed to the media back in 2019 that you had been diagnosed with kidney cancer. I'm wondering if you might be willing to share a bit of your cancer journey with our audience.
Yeah. So I was in Laredo, Texas. I have a traveling dinosaur museum. That's what I do during the school year, travel to elementary schools. Pretty much we focus Texas. I was down in Laredo and I had a very bad pain in my side. And, of course, with my lack of human anatomy, my first reaction was it must be, must be something dramatic because it hurts. So I went into an emergency room and they did something. It turned out to be diverticulitis. But the doctor said, at that time, when you get back to San Antonio, you need to see your doctor about your kidney, and kind of left it at that. So when I got back to San Antonio, I contacted my general practitioner and I said, kind of an odd thing. This is what they said. And my doctor kind of said, well, sometimes they see things that, can get them excited and that sort of stuff. What I'll do is I'll get the x-rays and I'll see what it is. And she called me 2 days later and said, I have an appointment for you with Dr. Harmon, who is a kidney specialist, and you need to be there tomorrow at 2 o'clock or whatever it was. Startled me to death. I go in, this man comes in, he sits down, he said, we've got to remove your kidney. You just completely, it's covered in cancer. And he said that it could be life threatening. And of course, I was absolutely stunned and startled and shocked and scared. But his mannerisms were such that it put me at ease after the initial shock, because I could see the switch between him being a doctor with some very serious information and then becoming a guy, just this man that just very calmly explain things, how it works, how this could have happened, why I didn't feel anything from it. He explained probably the best thing he did for me mentally was he said, George, you'll hear these stories of people that get diagnosed with cancer and they're dead within months. And it's not because they give up. It's because sometimes by the time the cancer exposes itself, they're too far beyond the point of us being able to fix it. That's not you. That's not this. And don't believe the hype that your mind turns off when you hear the word cancer. And that was what I always thought. I was always under the impression, you hear this all the time. Oh my gosh, so-and-so was diagnosed with cancer. And then they pass away within a month. And you think they must have just given up hope. And that's not the case. So he switched from being the doctor to being the guy. And then he switched back again. I could see his entire demeanor change as he was able to juggle between, I need to be straight and honest with you, but you also need to look at this not from the perspective of being shocked and scared. And so within a very short amount of time, they removed my kidney. And a year later, I went in for a checkup, and there were spots on my lungs, and he was concerned. But at that point, I got a new oncologist, and it was not the same situation then. It was almost, I felt like I was just like in an assembly line, like, yeah, you got spots all over your lungs. Don't know if it's going to be good or not. You need to, we'll check back with you. This could be really, really bad. Okay, have a good day, and I'll see you later. And I'm in the room just with my mouth open going, what? And so anyway, going back to Dr. Harmon, I said, would you please look at this? And again, it was, yeah, we don't know what's going on, but he explained things can happen. And anyway, long story short, that stuff is cleared up. It's not on my lungs. My last checkup was very good. No sign of it anywhere. Everything is clear and free. So I just had my kidney removed, but I never had to deal with any sort of the medications or any of that stuff. I was very fortunate. But the point I guess I'm trying to make is that in the position that you and your colleagues are in, it is a tough situation because you're dealing with very serious subjects. But what I can say, when I heard you explain how you try to talk to your patients, I am so glad that you guys have this podcast, that you're sharing this information, because as a layperson, everything about us is in your hands. And if it's a cold, direct, I'm going to use terminologies you'll never hear again, and you just kind of leave the patient, I think, with the fear of the unknown. And that can't help when somebody's dealing with cancer and they're scared to death and they don't know what's going on. So I would just say that the impact that my doctor had on me, Dr. Harmon had on me, was so positive, and it put me at ease. And I'm sure you would both agree that mentally, it's just as important for health as anything else when people are dealing with cancer. And so Dr. Harmon, in my case, took away the mental angst and left me with the ability to rationalize the reality of things.
Well, I just want to thank you for sharing that with us. And I also want to say how happy I am that you're free of cancer and doing well. I mean, I just don't know what I would do on those long car rides without the Dinosaur George podcast. But, with this in mind, one of our major challenges in oncology, I think medicine in general, is having more patients participate in clinical research or clinical trials. Clinical research, clinical trials are the most important way, arguably, that we gain new information that can be applied to patient care. We have a problem that 90% of patients say that they would participate in a clinical trial. Yet in this country, in adult patients, we probably only have 5% of patients actually participating in clinical research. And that really, as you can imagine, makes it harder to move the needle forward. And so, you having been on the patient side of the equation, what kind of advice might you give to physicians or other research staff in communicating about cancer and clinical trials?
That's a great point. And it never once would have ever dawned on me the value of people being associated with trials. And I don't think anybody that I've ever heard ever communicated it in the way that you just did. I don't think people understand the partnership that could be gained and the benefits that could be gained by being associated with it. And I think just what you just said would be a tremendous advantage for the public to hear so that there's an understanding why. I hate to say this, but one of the things that hurts the industry, I think, are all of these companies that promote, let's go out and sue the medical industry and join us and come and, and so when people hear clinical study, I think the average person almost hears that as something to do with legal stuff or scam. And I hate to say this, but coming from a person that's not in the medical industry, I can tell you that if somebody contacted me and said, we'd like for you to be a part of a clinical study, my first mind goes to, what are you selling? And so I think there's got to be a way to change the perception of the benefits. It would be an interesting thing. I don't know the rest of the world, but the junior league, I'm just going to use this as an example. The junior leagues that I'm familiar with are very, very active in doing things. They're very active in blood drives and they're very active in doing things. And maybe you would be able to start at a ground level, communicating with actual organizations that are not associated with your industry, but could be a benefit. Maybe to go to them and say, we do blood drives and we do these things, but here's what we need. And maybe creating your own little army of people that are out there promoting what you need. You too, through your podcast, you're going to reach somebody. But imagine if there was 70 of you two, each going to a different direction. So maybe a way to get people to participate is, instead of the shotgun approach, blasting and throwing out millions of pellets and hoping one of them hits, maybe there's a way to form some kind of partnership to just promote the idea. A church or any adult organization, and it has nothing to do with politics or religion or any of those things. I'm just thinking that there is a wealth of people out there who, if they understood what you need that would benefit society, I think people would be willing to come on board. But it's, how do you reach them? It would be frustrating to think there's millions of people that you could reach, but you're not getting any of them. But I think if you maybe even form a group within a city where it's all volunteer and just say, look, we need a drive. We do blood drives all the time. And everybody joins in on them because they recognize what they're doing. And so maybe you come up with a concept that says, here's what we need right now. We're testing this thing and we need a group of people to help us. I think that by approaching adult organizations, they might be a better resource than you think. Now, again, I'm thinking from outside. I have no comprehension of what you need. I don't know if it's age brackets or any of those things, but I'm just thinking that there's got to be a way at a ground level to get other people involved to help you find the people that you're looking for. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think this is just great to have kind of a outsider's perspective. And, just it didn't even dawn on me that approaching somebody about a clinical trial is almost like these telemarketers or lawyers who have advertising out there about mesothelioma or something. This is great.
Right. And again, you hear the words clinical trial, and I think right now that is embraced or heard through the lens of what is this? So I wonder if rebranding that. I will tell you this, that if there is a way that people can have a connection to something they want to get on board, there was a great push one time for trying to get people to donate to children that were having difficulty in smaller third world countries. But when they saw their biggest improvement in that is when you literally adopted a child. Now, how legitimate that was, I don't know. But I think it made people feel a part of something. And I don't know how you bridge that. But if people could feel like they are connected to a result, that they can actually see something, then I think that the participation goes up because they want to be able to say they did X. And I think clinical trial, it just in my personal opinion, is now viewed somewhat negatively.
Really a need to shift the branding from clinical trial equals experiment to clinical trial equals a way to do social good, the same way that donating blood helps your neighbor or helps somebody in your community. It's really shifting the lens in which people look at it, if I'm interpreting what you're saying, and I couldn't agree more.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's a brilliant concept.
Lauren, maybe we can write a letter to the editor about this with George for JAMA Oncology or something.
Honestly, I think that would be a great idea. George,
But
we're going to have to take you up on that maybe offline.
Well, you made a great point, though. The word blood drive, there's nothing negative whatsoever. It's all positive. Look, humans, we are herd animals. We are familiar animals. We are animals that have survived because we take care of each other. That's in it. That's part of us. And so when somebody in the group is hurt, other animals disregard them and see them as a liability. Humans come in to help. When I hear blood drive, my reaction is somebody in the herd needs help. So maybe if you could rebrand that as there's a call for help, who can come answer the call, who can step up and help us, who can be one of the soldiers on the front line that's going to help us beat this thing. I don't know what the rebranding is, but you hit the nail on the head, Lauren. I think you exactly described it perfectly. I think it's just a matter of rebranding and then finding those out there that can help you spread the word at the floor level. You could spend $50 million on an advertising campaign and it may not do anything. Or you can get a group of people who are associated with the benefit of society. Those are the groups you want to look for. And the only reason why I said the junior league is they're constantly doing things for their community. And so there's groups probably out there that would be that. I mean, what about, approaching NFL teams that says, we need your third string to be our front line. So let's say you live in Dallas and you go to the Cowboys and you say, look, this is what we're attempting to do and we need it. And even if they're not doing it, we would love for them to be our offensive line to stop cancer. They may not be participating in it, but they might be willing to say, we can stop it, but you've got to be behind us to make this work. Or, we'll block for you, but we need somebody to step up to take the ball. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I would believe sincerely that if the public heard what I just heard from you two, if more of the public heard what I understand about your need, I think more people will come to your aid.
I think a huge part also, like you mentioned, is our ability to do marketing of these concepts and not have, multi-million-dollar ad campaigns. Unfortunately, as we have funding cuts from the federal government for medical oncology and oncology research, There's not always that type of funds around, although the NFL may be a helpful solution. But a huge goal that we do have is to better leverage social media to be able to communicate with all of our stakeholders. And in fact, at our semi-annual meetings for NRG Oncology, we have a social media workshop to help our members better utilize social media. And I think in truth, in medicine, we are definitely far behind a lot of other industries in realizing the potential of social media to spread messaging. An example of that really is that this NRG Oncology podcast launched in 2024 and is the first podcast ever developed by an NCI cooperative group, especially when podcasts have been around for decades. So can you talk to us a little bit about how the Dinosaur George podcast has capitalized on social media over the years to build your audience base and really reach people across the globe?
The podcast emerged out of COVID. During COVID, when I just built my house, I built a recording studio within my house because my intention was to continue to do a podcast for adults. I used to do a dinosaur podcast for adults where I would bring in experts from all over and interview them. And it was a lot of fun. But I decided that since so many kids were at home because of COVID, I would just do a podcast for kids. And it exploded. It just took off. And so the podcast began to grow simply because of the subject matter. But then I started recognizing that I could create a Patreon club, that I could use my podcast to promote the Patreon club. The Patreon club would fund the time that I'm spending on my podcast. And it becomes this self-sustaining thing. I've had so many people contact me asking if they could sponsor the podcast, and I don't want outside sponsors because I want to control what's being said and what's being promoted. I don't want them promoting something that I don't think is family friendly. And so it started to grow. And then we created a Facebook page. So the Facebook page is where children can put their artwork. They can post questions. They can do that. The podcast, I will read some of their questions and highlight some of their artwork. Then on the Patreon club, one of the benefits of being a top tier member is you get to ask questions that other people don't get to ask. When it's your birthday, you get a shout out for your birthday. Well, that just started to grow exponentially because now you have a child who can have their name heard on a podcast, and that's there forever. It's forever. They get to do it forever. This three-tiered approach, the podcast is the engine, the Facebook posts are the eyes, and the Patreon club is everything else in this machine. And all of them grow exponentially with each other. And so now you have a child that hears me read a question from a little boy in Spain. And maybe this girl lives in Italy. And she goes, how cool would it be for my name to be said on a podcast? So how do I get to do that? And then I go to the Dinosaur George Kids Facebook group and post pictures or questions. So they rush there to do that in the hopes that I read their comment. And so it's this machine that just grows. And then you have kids that join the Patreon club because they want all the inside stuff. They get lessons through. We do Zoom lessons all the time for our Patreon club members. And so all of this social media kind of comes together and all sort of drives this whole machine. I was just looking, we're almost now at, I think, maybe 1,500,000 downloads of the podcast. And that number is staggering to me, but it just grows exponentially. And then you look at all the friends on Facebook and, you were mentioning about social media. One of the benefits of social media, I think right now, I can tell you both right now that when Stephen first described what you're doing, I was impressed. I think it's really cool. But to hear both of you, if you two would just go on to Zoom, would just record a visual podcast of you two and then put it on a Facebook page, it's there forever. It can be 20 minutes. It can be 10 minutes. But your message, the things that you've been telling me, that message could go out and it could be shared And the next thing you know, people over the world are watching what you two just said. And it can be short and precise and to the point. So I think there's so much benefit of using social media in ways that you may not be thinking. Or you post a short video about here's why people in our industry need you. And you create an ad. Doesn't cost you anything, a little bit of editing if that's even necessary. So I use social media a lot, and it's helped grow the brand. And I'm reaching people I never thought I could reach, that I never would have reached had it not been for social media.
Well, George, I just want to thank you again, not only for joining us today, but all of your insights, all of the content that you put out there every week on the Dinosaur George podcast. For those of you in the audience, again, this is George Blasing, the host of the Dinosaur George podcast, which has directly inspired this NRG Oncology podcast. And if you have small children, I totally recommend it for those long car rides. The NRG Oncology Group is funded by the National Cancer Institute, and content of this podcast does not necessarily reflect that of the National Institutes of Health. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and happy clinical trials.